Hello, in this video you'll see a game between Alireza Firouzja and Yevgeny Najer from round 7 of Grand Swiss. The opening was Petrov, but Petrov which resembles more of a Spanish, open Spanish, after d4. And we have d8, d5, and now Alireza chose to play knight d2, and in the game with Abbasov, his opponent played bishop e7 in round 2 or 3. But now Najer chose to just capture, and after bishop d2 to go bishop e7. And now c3 to take over the control over the center, over d4 square. But now black tries to counter with c5. Bishop d3 and now knight c6. White castled and now bishop g4 to pin the knight and also to take on e5. So Alireza plays rook e1, queen d7, and now h3 by Alireza. Bishop h5 and bishop f4. Queen e6 and bishop e2. First, before he plays queen d2, he wants to not allow black to double on f3. So he plays this. Black castles and now queen d2. And here Najer plays bishop g6. It was better to play h6 here to not allow knight g5 in the future. And here white would maybe have something like knight d4 to capture the bishop pair anyways. Because now queen g6 to just avoid getting his bishop taken by the bishop would be bad because of knight c6, bc, and g4, which would lead to trapping this bishop. Because once the king gets to h2, the bishop is gone, because queen cannot maintain the pin without leaving the g6. After knight d4, then black would have to capture on d4, and after bishop h5, he would take on c3, bc, because if queen c3, then this double attack is nice. And if queen f3, then I think knight d4 should be fine. And if you maintain defending both bishops, in the end of this variation, knight c2 is taking the exchange. So after dc, bc is the best, and after d4, bishop g4. Because if he takes immediately, then rook goes to d8 and black gets some activity. So bishop g4 was best, but now black can take on c3, and after takes, bishop b4, queen g3, queen g6. White is still slightly better, but black also has a good play. Instead, he plays bishop g6, which allow knight g5 in a few moves. First, he plays rook a d1, and after bishop e4, he plays knight g5. Also, if here he played the rook a d8, it would still allow knight g5, which is very unpleasant now, because if he takes, the rook has to go to d7, and now white probably has something like f4, and something like g4 and f5 is never pleasant for black. So he plays bishop e4 here, but now Alireza has knight g5. And now black is forced to give up his bishop pair. Takes, and now d4. For example, if he took on e5 here, then white has f3 to move the bishop from defending d5 pawn, and when he goes to g6, then black can first play bishop c4. to include his bishop, and when the queen goes back, then queen d5 would be very strong, and because of the bishop pair. And also white has some ideas like f4, f5 to trap the bishop on g6, and even if he gets h6, bishop h7, his bishop would be quite bad on h7. So instead he plays d4. Now white plays bishop f1, and now queen e5 would be bad because of f3 and simply losing the bishop because of the pin. So he plays queen g6 instead. Queen f4, and now bishop c2. Rook d2, and rook a e8. If he tried something like dc3 to release the tension in the center, then white would capture. And if he tries to move the bishop, which is quite annoying on g5 with h6, then white has this nice move, bishop takes h6. And if queen takes, you exchange and take on c2, and white remains with a pawn up. And if he tries something like gh, then white takes on c2, and after takes, rook e3. And it appears to be that white has a very nice attack here. And if he tries something like rook fd8, then e6 is strong, and if queen goes back to h7, then takes. And now you cannot really capture because of something like rook g3 or just capturing on h6. With rook g3 next. So after king f8, now he has rook g3, threatening to go rook g8 next. So black tries knight e7, and now bishop c4, renewing this threat of rook g8. And if he tries to block by knight g6, then this, queen g7 and queen e6. And the knight is going to hang on the next move, and it's looking really bad for black. In the game, he played rook a e8 instead. Now bishop h4 to avoid f6. Because if he plays some random move like a3 here, now black can use the fact that rook on e1 is not defended, and he can play f6, and after bishop h4, this e5 pawn is for free. So that's why he plays bishop h4. So if now he plays f6, then e6 is very strong, and if he tries to attack it by bishop f5, then bishop c4 holds this pawn, and this is very annoying for black, because if he tries to double on the e-file, then even g4 works, with queen d6 next, targeting c5. So f6 would not work in this position at all. He plays king h8 instead, and now f3. Connecting bishop and rook on e1, and now a6. Maybe trying to stop bishop b5 and pinning the knight, because he wants to keep the d4 square under control. Now bishop f2, he's aiming to destabilize black's center with this move. Rook d8, trying to support his d4 pawn, and now rook c1. Black plays bishop b1. If he tried something like bishop f5 here, then g4 would be interesting, and after bishop e6 to capture on d4, and after all these exchanges, taking on a2, rook d6 would be strong, and if he takes, the d pawn is very problematic for black. And if he tries queen e6, rook c7, white has a very nice position here, because his d6 pawn is very dangerous, and also black's pawns are quite vulnerable on both sides, especially on the queen side. So he plays bishop b1 instead. And now Alireza took knight d4, and we had some exchanges here. And now a3, trying to prevent black from taking on a2, and also keeping the pressure on d4 pawn. Bishop a2, and now rook takes d4. Finally, white gets this pawn, and black tries to pin the rook on d4 by queen b6, but now rook cd1. It's played by Firouzja, and rook fe8 by black. And now I think white made a big mistake here, allowing black to almost equalize the position. He plays king h2. Here he should have played b4. And now if he tries to play like in the game, take on d4, queen d4, takes, and plays g5 to fix the pawn on e5, and also to make breathing space for his king, then white can play rook d7, and in case of b5, all this was played in the game. Just the difference is that the king is not on h2, pawn was on b4 here. And now after rook d6 and takes, rook a6, now black doesn't have bishop c4, because in this case, after takes, the b pawn is advanced, and in the game it is still on b2. So it allows black to target the b2 pawn, and now white would be able to just play rook c6 and start pushing those two pawns, and at the same time controlling the c4 pawn. But instead, in the game, king h2 was played. And now, with the same couple of moves, rook d4, g5, with the same idea of getting his king some space, and also not allowing white to push f4 to defend e5, now rook d7, b5, rook d6, rook takes e5, rook a6. Now it's good to play bishop c4, because now after takes, the b2 pawn is backward, and black can always arrange some kind of attack on b2. And now Alireza chose a4, but now black tries to exchange the c4 pawn for b2 pawn, after which this ending would be a draw. Alireza plays rook b6, and now c3. Of course, white is forced to take, because if he doesn't, then black is going to push c2 next and promote. So he takes, and a5. King gets active, a6, and now rook a3. King g3, and now black didn't want to allow king g4, so he plays rook a2, targeting the g2 pawn. And now probably Alireza didn't see anything better, because if he tries to go from this side, Najer might have played rook a1 to just annoy this king and cut him off from the first rank. So he tries with f4 here. Black took, and now takes on g2. King e5, and now goes back to a2 to hold this a pawn. He goes to d6, and now black starts to run with f5. And Alireza played king c7. If he tried king e5, now rook h2 would be strong, taking the h3 pawn, and he cannot defend it properly, because if rook b3, then rook a2. White has to choose either a6 or h3, which one to give. And if he takes on f5 here, then rook takes h3, and black has an h pawn, which is a good counterplay in case white's king gets to b7. In that case, black's pawn would be running, and it would be sufficient for a draw. So here king c7 was played, and now black starts running. King b8, f3, a7, and now black plays f2. So white's rook has to go to b1 now. He played f1 queen, which is a big mistake, leading to a loss. Here just king f6 would make a draw, and in case of winning, they would take, and king g5. Now, black's king is headed towards the h3 pawn, and if rook f1 to take the pawn, king h4, takes, and now white's king is too far from the h pawn. He tries to get it, and just, if in case of rook f5, now king g4, and we have this h pawn which is too fast. And white's king cannot approach. Black is just going to shoulder him, and that's game over. It's a draw. So here he took on he played f1 queen, and he took. Rook b2 was played, and king a8. And after rook b3, Alireza plays rook c1. He tries somehow to make a bridge by playing rook c8 or rook c7, rook b7, and to not allow black to give up his rook for a pawn. But also, in this moment, black has trouble with his king. His king is not very close to the h pawn, so even if black manages to give his rook for a pawn, he's not in time to capture on h3. So he tries to get in time by playing king g6. Now rook c7. The point behind this move is that if king goes any further, by king g5 you can take on h7. And now it doesn't matter if h3 is going to hang, because next move is going to be rook b7 and king b8 just promoting, and black has no pawns left. So he tries h5 here. Rook b7, and now he takes on h3, which is logical. If he plays something like rook a3, then just king b8, and next move he promotes, because king g5 is not quick enough. You can defend the pawn and just bring the king closer, and that's it. So he took on h3, his last chance. But now Alireza plays rook b6, king g5, and now king b7. He's not even allowing black to capture his pawn with the rook. Rook a3, and now rook a6. White made the bridge and played rook a6. Now black tries to give checks, but now after king c7, Najer resigned because he can only give checks like this, and until white escapes to g7. Here there's no checks, and white is going to promote on the next move. So the crucial mistake here was promoting instead of king h6. King h6 would be just on time to capture an h3 and start pushing the h pawn. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.